Hello and welcome to today's remote session. This is Tom Bechtold from SecureWorld Digital. Today is Tuesday, August 20th, and we're going to be talking about the growing role of GRC controls in financial regulation. A lot of stuff to talk about here, right? So lots of new regulations to worry about, lots of more headaches for our friends out in financial services to be having to deal with. So I want to say thank you, first off, to the folks over at Anecdotes for making today's discussion possible. We're going to be taking questions throughout. Just throw those in the chat. I'm going to be kind of quizzing our panel of folks. So if I can sprinkle in questions, I will. If not, and this is probably more likely, I'm going to probably send that list of questions off to our panelists. We'll try to get you some answers and send those off to you. So that being said, today's slides, as well as a few URLs and PDFs are going to be available in that resource tab. I'm going to be honest with you, the slides today, it's pretty much just some stuff I put together because you have to have slides on this platform. So if you're grabbing them for certifying body stuff, that's great. But if you're really doing it for like, I'm going to come back and learn some stuff, you're not going to learn anything from these slides. So, but if you need it for CPs, definitely grab them. But those are available in there as well, PDF. Questions, we talked about that. Certificate of attendance, after about 45 minutes, the system will generate one for you. So it is a little pop-up. There's a timer that you guys can see down there. Watch that. If you have to reset, sometimes that messes with the clock. I've been getting this one a lot lately. That's why I'm bringing it up. If you reset, it does mess with that clock, but it does actually give you the CPE credit thing at 45 minutes, regardless of what that timer says if it's wrong. So it still works. If you are having any issues, refresh F5, function F5. That's going to fix most of the problems out there. If you're on one of the quote-unquote weird browsers, I don't know what that means, but Safari, Edge, Chrome, Firefox, those work pretty good. Use those if you're having some serious problems. But we do record these. We keep them available for the next 6 months on the website, really for educational purposes. So you can actually share this and collaborate with friends and colleagues. If you're running into folks in the financial services arena that are having problems with these regulations popping out, share this with them, please. So that being said, let's get this show on the road, as they say. The financial landscape is complex. It's full of regulations, risks, governance challenges. I talked about it just a moment ago, headaches, right? There's a lot of headaches out there. As the regulatory environment tightens and financial institutions are facing more and more scrutiny, the role of GRC controls has never been more critical. So today, that's what we're talking about. We're going to delve into how these controls are evolving to become the backbone of operational resilience and risk mitigation in financial industry. So that being said, who are we actually going to listen to today? It's not me. I'm just asking the questions. We're going to hear from Marina Kaganovich. She is an AMR's Financial Services Executive Trust Lead for the Office of the CISO at Google Cloud, one of our favorite cloud providers, I will say. I mean, I use Google Cloud all the time. So anyway, Kenneth Moras. He is the Security GRC Lead over at Plaid. And then we also have Jake Bernardis. He is the CISO over at Anecdotes, our sponsor for today. So what I would like to ask everybody here today, the bios are in the menu bar. You guys can all check those out. These folks have street cred. They really do. But what I want to ask is their backstory is, what made you get into computers? Maybe it was in college. Maybe it was when you were in elementary school you knew. But what made you think, you know what, I'm getting into computers. I love this stuff. Let's start with Marina.
Great question. So actually, I stumbled into this, honestly. And these days, I primarily focus on AI and cybersecurity, neither of which are fields that I intended to go into when I started out as an attorney in financial services. But actually, the more I got exposure in finance, the more I came to realize that there was a growing trend toward innovation through digitalization and automation, both of which seemed like really cool. And so I kind of took an opportunity that I had to make the career transition. And I have to say, I've never looked back. It's a very exciting space.
Thank you for that. Appreciate that. Over to Kenneth. Same question. What made you get into computers way back when?
When I was a kid, I used to enjoy playing games. It started as simple as Mario. And eventually I realized that there's a lot of creativity and logic in building these games. It's a lot of interesting programming skills. And I finally realized that this is something that I want to learn, do my engineering in computer science. And eventually I stumbled into cybersecurity, but I'm so glad that I'm in this field of the right intersection of computer science and cybersecurity.
Literally gaming for the win. I love it. I love it. And don't forget the critical thinking skills too, because you gotta react pretty quick even on Mario Kart, right? So I mean, you gotta be moving. So thank you for that. Appreciate it, Jake. Same question for you. What made you get into computers?
Look, I'm an ex-pen tester, ex-ethical hacker, and for me, it started similar to Kenneth with games, right? I remember having a ZX Spectrum. We used to put the cassette in and turn it around halfway through on things like Dizzy Egg and various other Entity games at the time. I remember wanting to try and break the game because inherently every hacker is lazy, and they want to find a way to do things quicker and cheaper and more efficiently. So you start trying to work out how can you manipulate, how can you twist things, how can you change things to mean that you're in control rather than the game's in control of you. I think that's where I really got my love of technology computers from, is trying to break them almost.
I like it. I like it. Works. It works. Excellent. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate you guys humoring me with my question there. I always just like to know where folks kind of come from and why they decided to do what they do. Anyway, let's jump into the real questions now. So we're going to talk about some of these different regulations. So I'm going to kind of unpack DORA, if you will, not the Explorer, mind you, the Digital Operational Resilience Act. This was designed to fix the fact that EU financial regulation didn't manage all components of operational resilience. With DORA, financial institutions must follow rules for the protection, detection, containment, recovery, and repair capabilities against ICT-related incidents. DORA acknowledges that ICT incidents and a lack of operational resilience have the possibility of jeopardizing an entire financial system. Okay, so that's the background on what DORA is. My first question, I'm going to steer this one to Jake, since you're my guy in the EU. What makes DORA different than others, and why should companies care?
I thought, given the accent, this might land with me pretty quickly. So I think what makes DORA different is it builds on existing things to make them more complex in a regulatory stance, more tight in a control stance, and more broad in a coverage stance. So what you've got is effectively an admission that actually financial institutions belong to national and international critical infrastructure. I'm sure we'll talk about that at some point later on today or in this conversation. And them failing to respond or contain or survive a cyber or ICT outage, because this isn't purely related to hacking, but to ICT outages as well. And we had a great one a few weeks ago in CrowdStrike that pointed out just how dangerous it is for critical infrastructure to fall over. So DORA is based around the principle of making those things go deep. It's acknowledging that financial institutions, particularly from an IT stance, are now a massive part of our lives. I don't know how it is where everyone else is in the world, but in the UK, in the north of the UK where I live now, you can't physically go to a bank. Right? My nearest branch is miles and miles away. The bank's closed physical footprints in favor of going to digital. And they're being disrupted by digital banks, Monzo, Starling, there's loads, there's Chime in the US, who are disrupting the sector by providing pure digital banking. Now, once you get to a point where you are primarily traditional banking, but now primarily digital or pure digital financial institutions, you have to get better controls in place from an ICT perspective, because the bank simply can't continue to operate, right? If you get hacked as Barclays in the past or HSBC, you could still say, well, we can go to a physical bank teller and you can still take money out. If you're a Chime or a Monzo, you can't do that. So if you can't stand up, you present a problem for the critical infrastructure of a nation or a series of nations, and B, you fail to be able to operate as a business. And that's bad for both the individual entity, the bank itself, but also for the wider market. The last part I'll come to, then I'll shut up, is it DORA, where other financial regulations in ICT and cyber historically have just covered the banks themselves, or PCI DSS, for example, if you do process payments, DORA covers others. So anyone who provides critical infrastructure or critical ICT platforms to financial institutions to allow them to present and provide their services is also covered under DORA. So you can look at entities like GCP with Green on the line, or whether that is Plaid or whoever that might be that's involved in that supply chain. If they're geographically relevant, they become part of this regulation, which is different to how it was historically in the financial sector.
Thank you for that. Ken, anything you might want to add to that?
Echoing to that, essentially, think of this in a very simple terms. If people cannot receive money timely, or if insurance providers cannot provide insurance timely to consumers, it is really disruptive. And Europe has really understood that the operational resiliency is super, super critical, and they've extended it to wide ranges of organizations, and they come up with a more robust framework with like 140 plus requirements and how an organization can increase their operational resiliency. And they've understood that the modern threat landscape has changed. Your reliance on supply chain and on your vendors has increased. So they have crafted this new framework to acknowledge the existence of how industries operate and the risks that they see, and they've incorporated this into this framework. And as a result, this is becoming more and more critical for organizations to adopt a more comprehensive framework to improve their resiliency. So DORA is definitely something in many organizations' radar in the recent past.
Thank you for that, Ken. Let's see here. Can you, anybody actually for this one, can you give us an example of what DORA really requires, and specifically in relation to GRC, what those teams would need to do?
Yeah, I can field that one if you want, as the kind of maybe the GRC vendor provider here. But look, there's kind of a 6-step process to like the GRC part of DORA. You've got to complete a gap analysis that says, here are the list of all the controls relevant to DORA. Here's where we currently are in relation to them. Do we comply or don't we comply? And here's the relevant evidence that supports that statement. That's the kind of thing that we vendor pierce. That's what Anecdotes does. It automates compliance against frameworks to show how you can do this in evidence-driven approach without having to get the evidence to show compliance. That's our piece, right? You then develop a risk management framework. So you've got to show, like, if once you identify what your risks are in relation to DORA, how do you demonstrate and basically put them onto paper? Like, who do they belong to? What are the strategies for working with them? Are you going to effectively accept them? Are you going to transfer them? Are you going to try and remediate and tackle them? Who's going to do that work? What's the time frame? Let's have like an actual proper risk register around it. You've got to have an ability to respond to incidents. That's GRC as well as technical. The technical side to how do you actually rebuild. The GRC is the actual process, the documentation, the procedures, the testing around that. You have to test not just around outages or incidents, but how you respond to business continuity or resiliency issues. You've got to do some third-party work. So you've got to assess the third parties as part of your provision of a financial service to assess that they meet the requirements of DORA and or any additional requirements that you might have. And you've then got to work on the information sharing and relevant privacy as well as financial regulation side, which also comes into GRC of how do you communicate that to the relevant third parties, stakeholders, and also external interested parties, maybe your customers at the end.
Thank you for that. Anybody else want to add on to DORA before I move to our next regulation?
Yeah, I can chime in a bit. Like, the concept similar to DORA is not just restricted to Europe. Like, you will see even UK coming with their UK Resiliency Act. So you will see similar flavors of DORA being implemented in different geos, and this will continue to be an important thing for GRC teams to monitor, right? DORA is just one part of operational resiliency that is important for Europe, but you will have similar style of frameworks and regulations that are popping up in different countries. And UK Resilience Act is a very good example of something that you need to also monitor for different geos. If you operate in UK, if you have an entity in UK, or you outsource critical operations to UK-based entities, these are something that you need to consider and monitor.
Leading on to Kenneth, regulations have a kind of effect where they spread. So once somebody starts doing it, firstly, other nations or regulatory bodies will look at it and say, well, maybe we should do something similar because of A, B, and C. Yeah. And secondly, once a business starts to implement controls to meet the requirements of, say, a DORA or something else, then they've already got those controls in place. So doing that for other geos becomes much more easy and straightforward. So you find that once you've got something like DORA rolling, it will roll further, not just into the UK, but probably across mainland continental Asia, where it goes quite often into India. There's quite strong regulations in Canada and Australia frequently, and then eventually it gets to the US. And so I think this will be the beginning of changing the financial regulation in relation to ICT and cyber.
Yep.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, thank you. As I mentioned, we're going to shift gears to a different regulation. The next one is NYDFS. NYCRR Part 500. This is a mouthful to say. Obviously, it has to do with New York. Following increased cyber threats to financial systems, the New York Department of Financial Services imposed a new set of cybersecurity requirements on financial institutions that are licensed or authorized to do business in the state. They're designed to protect consumer data and the information technology systems of of financial institutions. The most recent revisions include additional controls that need to be implemented and monitored in topics such as vulnerability management, endpoint security, and risk management. So my question, I'm going to start with Marina on this one, I believe. My question to you is, since it was first enacted in 2017, NYCRR has continued to develop and include new obligations. Do you find a commonality in these updates? What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. You know, when DFS Rule 500 was first introduced, it was really revolutionary in terms of its prescriptiveness. And I remember actually being on the team that was tasked with assessing the new requirements and having these conversations with industry veterans who were really shocked by just how detailed the requirements were. Because really until then, what they had been used to seeing was these more sort of general principles-based guidance that provided a lot of discretion and flexibility in terms of like what an appropriate cyber control would look like. And in the last few years, since the initial passing of DFS 500, there were a couple of draft revisions that have been proposed. And in late last year, the finalized version of the revisions were issued, which now require even additional significant enhancements to an organization's cyber program. And so they impose requirements for a new category of quote unquote Class A companies. They include the need for independent audits of their cyber programs relative to their risk assessment. And they're also looking for detailed privilege management monitoring requirements, as well as endpoint security and detection and response controls. And these are also, you know, there are also new governance requirements as well. So there's additional reporting on remediation plans that pertain to addressing material issues, as well as regarding reporting for significant cyber events. And so in making these revisions, the NYDFS was actually very transparent about what drove the change. And they explained that it was really aimed at addressing the trend that they were seeing with the increased sophistication of threat actors and the growing velocity of the cyber attacks. And in addition, actually, to placing more accountability on CISOs, the requirements for the board have expanded as part of this regulation as well, which the board would now need to demonstrate sort of a sufficient understanding of cyber issues and how they're handled across the organization, which interestingly, and to the point that was made earlier, in terms of driving overall regulatory trend, you know, this really echoes similar rules that we've seen in other regulations, such as the SEC that had also proposed having quote unquote qualified board members with cyber expertise. So I think what you really start to see is really this trend emerging with a high degree of overlap in the regulatory requirements globally becoming more prescriptive because of the recognition that with that digital interconnectedness, there's this like significant cyber risk with existing technologies, certainly, but also there are novel risks that are being posed and coming to light with relatively nascent technologies as well, such as Gen AI.
Yeah.
Tom, can I steal your job for a second? I have a question for Marina, for my own personal use. So I entirely agree with the prescriptive elements, because I think that for a long time, words like sufficient and appropriate have given me an absolute headache and stress around kind of privacy and a lot of regulation where you're like, what is appropriate and sufficient? And so I'm all for prescriptive things. But here's the question I always wonder, you know, when you have like these state regulations, Marina, like this one in context, is it applicable to where operations are or to where business is headquartered? Because I always think in US regulation, you can kind of just play the state kind of registration game and therefore get out of regulations and change what's applicable to you and what's not. So how does this stack up if you're not headquartered in the US, but obviously most banks have a presence on Wall Street around that area?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And honestly, I'm going to give you sort of that typical, you know, lawyer answer, and the words are, it depends. And so for certain regulations apply for where businesses are headquartered or registered, right? But more likely it's where they do business, which is likely going to be from a state perspective outside of just the state in which they are registered. Other regulations actually pertain to where the customers are, because that's where they feel that the impact is most likely to be felt. So it goes on a regulation per regulation basis, but certainly NYDFS in the financial space helps set the bar because of the number of firms that are registered in the state of New York.
That makes sense. Do you think it'll become federal? Do you think there'll become a point where these regulations in the US are rolled out on a federal level rather than on a state-by-state level to make them broadly more applicable and the whole thing a lot easier to implement?
You know, there's so much debate on that point. And I'm sure actually we'll touch on this a little bit later on as well, but it's hard to tell because just traditionally the approach to regulation in the US has been very fragmented. And in order to get anything done at a federal level requires an immense amount of political will. And so it's hard to say at this point whether it'll become a federal standard, but I think just from a competition perspective, firms tend to start complying with the most stringent standards because that's what customers often come to expect, irrespective of whether that's something that's required at a federal legal level.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And just to chime in, I remember during my times at Facebook where we had money transmitter licenses, the multiple states want to audit your payments program, but NYDFS was one of the most stringent and they had more specific requirements. So if you mostly complied with NYDFS 500, you would automatically pass the bar expected out of other states. And NYDFS has had some of the things were very interesting. Like they specified retain your logs for 3 years. And the recent updates have also caught up with the changes. They have come up with very specific requirements on like if you are paying for ransomware, you have to notify us within 24 or X amount of hours. So I've seen some very unique and specific changes that have come in with NYDFS. So all the regulations are trying to catch up with what's happening in the real world, and we'll see a lot of changes, and GRC teams will need to continuously monitor and react to these nuanced changes.
Totally agree. Okay, so let's shift gears to our next regulation here. This is NIST 2. This one is following the limited success of GDPR, the EU decided to give this kind of regulation a new try. The Network and Information Security Directive 2 was written into the law almost unnoticed last January and will come into force in all EU member states and in some form in the UK in October this year. NIST 2 is focused on critical infrastructure, which everyone worries about, has more granular requirements, and requires annual evidence of compliance, not just self-attestation. I can never say that properly. It focuses on 4 key areas: risk management, protections against cyber attacks, detecting security events, and minimizing the impact of incidents. My question, and again, it's Europe, so I got to start with Jake. Europe has now classified financial institutions as critical infrastructure. Do you agree they should be included?
100%. Like, the thing I like about NIST 2 is it defined critical infrastructure, what actually exists as critical infrastructure in our modern world. The other thing they really probably miss is social media platforms, which probably is now a part of critical infrastructure. But like historically, we talk about kind of water, power, and those kind of elements that provide our ability to live and to survive, but it's just not fact anymore. Like we can see from, I said a couple of weeks ago, look at CrowdStrike. Critical infrastructure, airlines. If they go down, the world falls to its knees. The S&P falls apart temporarily, albeit temporarily, and everything else around it goes. Like if we look at what modern day critical infrastructure is, it has to include finance. It has to include telco, because if we have no internet connection, no phone availability, we can't work and we cease to be able to function. It has to include ICT providers, because if GCP, if Marina's company go down, we've got a problem, right? There's a lot of businesses in the world who cease to be able to act. So I think NIST 2, which is not to be confused with NIST in the US standard, is bang on the money in broadening what critical infrastructure means, because it encompasses what modern critical infrastructure is. And that's not about water or about light or about gas. That's about the things that we need and consume to be able to provide services, maintain businesses, and be able to produce economic outcomes, without which we've proven in the last month, we fall apart.
Very much so. Very much so. Appreciate that. Marina, do you think that the financial institutions in the U.S. are ready for something like this?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think, so US financial institutions individually are already heavily regulated. So many of which are going to be regulated by more than one regulator in the US. But the financial services sector as a whole, I think it's already considered critical infrastructure by the Department of Homeland Security, which really echoes that view, similar to DORA and NIS2, as we just discussed, that underscores their critical role in maintaining economic stability and in preventing disruptions that could have very significant and far-reaching consequences. However, unlike for DORA and NIS2, in the US, there's that fragmented approach that we talked about a moment ago, where regulation applies to financial institutions from various perspectives. Some regulations come from federal and state laws, but there are also financial institutions that are overseen by agencies that govern different aspects of the financial system. So you'll have regulations that pertain to banks versus broker-dealers versus depository corporations, et cetera. So really, on top of this patchwork of rules and regulation, there are also industry standards that financial institutions typically follow, such as NIST, and also regulatory interpretive guidance that they abide by, because that supplements the broad stroke requirements that have traditionally been promulgated through the rules to enable the necessary flexibility and adjustments to the business mix. But I think, when it comes to cybersecurity and resilience, NYDFS Rule 500 is a great example. And other agencies such as the SEC and the CFTC, they've also put out guidance on it, requiring more and more sort of formality when it comes to programs for cyber controls, incident response planning, BCDR, and third-party risk management, just sort of as a few examples. And then on the other side of regulation, there are also the threats. It's the ransomware attacks that we're seeing. It's the data breaches. It's the third-party risk management failures. All of those are also driving that focus on promoting cyber hygiene. And so in combination, all of this kind of creates a flywheel effect. The more there's a focus on the financial services sector as being critically important, the more legislation and regulation is put out to bolster the controls that are required. And then the higher the standards become, so that they can contribute to supporting confidence that the sector as a whole is really functioning as expected and can be trusted by consumers. So I think, to come back to your initial question, while the US may not be as centralized as Europe in terms of regulations like NIS2 or DORA, I think we should expect to see a continued focus on robust cyber controls and the ability to demonstrate resilience, though there's certainly a point of debate, as we mentioned earlier, about whether centralization is really an option when it comes to compliance with the various requirements, or if we'll continue to see regulations through that fragmented patchwork approach that we have today.
Yeah, thank you for that. Appreciate that. As I'm thinking about this, I think it might be helpful if maybe we could get a highlight of the differences between NIS2 and GDPR. Ken or Jake, do you guys want to take a crack at that?
I can take a crack at it. So at a very high level, they're fundamentally different. There are different scopes, but mostly if you think of it as NIS2 has components of cybersecurity in it. It goes in detail what is expected out of an incident response, whom to report, and there are different cybersecurity obligations as well in NIS2. But GDPR is taking a more of a privacy-centric approach, like what are the rights of individuals with respect to their data? Can they delete? Can they access? So it's fundamentally different in how GDPR and NIS2 is structured, regardless of the focus areas. GRC teams, if they have privacy in their purview, they will still need to monitor these unique requirements and build and support their organizations to better comply against these regulations. I would say that is a key difference. But again, there are multiple sub differences around the scope, the regulators, the reporting obligations. There are many unique differences that come with both of these. But primarily, I would say that conceptually they are different.
I would summarize to say primarily GDPR is focused around me and who I am, and NIS2 is focused around me and what I do. So GDPR is there to protect my personal data, my personal assets, per se, the value of what the world knows about me. NIS2 is to focus to protect the things that I need to continue to do the stuff that I do, whether that is the provision of ICT or telecommunications or financial networks and the ability to move and transfer and to receive money, whether that is the ability to access electricity, gas, solar, health resources, whatever they might be, is the things that I need to sustain my activities, whereas GDPR is about the protection of my identity.
Yeah. Gotcha. So how do these changes affect folks that are actually doing this job? You know, they're trying to be compliant. They're trying to make sure that they're staying, within regulations. How do these changes affect just Joe compliance doing his job?
I think it depends who they are. So I think there's two different arguments to take. Firstly is the worker and then the leader or the owner. So I think the leader and the owner becomes much more vulnerable. So we might go into the SolarWinds conversation, Tim Brown, but like if you look at what happened with the Supreme Court and the SEC's findings or rulings against him, the Supreme Court overthrowing almost all of them, what you're seeing is now that CISOs or security leaders are inherently personally vulnerable and therefore also aware of that vulnerability. NIS2 is similar. It makes an individual responsible for the things that they oversee and provide leadership or oversight over. And that's really hard, right? I mean, we could go on a long debate on transparency, but the reality is if I write a security policy, do I know with 100% surety that 100% of it is 100% in action? That's very hard for any CISO to say. Like if you look at some of the instances that happen to SolarWinds, they are probably outside of the purview or even visibility of the CISO to know that specific password policies were not being adhered to or specific credentials were being shared in one place or another that he probably didn't have any visibility or insight into. Now, whether he should or should not is a different debate. But I think these changes of regulation are definitely putting more impetus and more fear into security leaders who now have personal liability insurance, they probably did anyway, but are more cognizant of what they say and what they write, what they release publicly. The second side is the workers. I think there's two sides to this as well. One is it's getting easier and one is it's getting harder. It's getting easier because, as Marina points out, it's getting more granular and more prescriptive. The more regulations come, the more they detail what the control is versus historically saying sufficient and appropriate. And that makes it easier for me to tell a team, go and implement these controls because they can literally read, this is what we do, here's how we did it, here's the evidence, tick. And that's, again, what Anecdotes does as a product. But it's also getting harder because they're constantly changing. Like, I've had this same webinar probably 4 times in the last 18 months, and it's been about a different regulation, which either supersedes or adds on to or replaces or disagrees with various other regulations, either inherently in the same nation or same nation states or internationally. And that's becoming really complicated in terms of if you're a team, how do you keep on top of what's the newest and latest and greatest? But also, how do you decide which is the driving force of the business? Kenneth mentioned earlier, Marina's mentioned too. If you apply this regulation, you're pretty much doing these ones too. Well, you have to pick which is this regulation. Like, what are you going to adhere to as your gold standard? And once you get that and you get the granular controls, it becomes easy. But that stuff is complicated and it's not getting any easier. GRC is getting harder, if anything, to work out like how you dictate and guide your business.
For sure, definitely. Let's shift gears here. You brought up CrowdStrike a couple of times. I think we should talk about that. We're about a month or so past what happened there. Has this changed how we think about critical infrastructure? This just anybody can chime in on this one.
I'll go because I want to pose a question to Marina and Kenneth off the back of what I say. But okay. So I find CrowdStrike really interesting. I inherently am not an advocate for attacking people for when wrong. CrowdStrike is a great company. They've grown very fast for a reason. They'll recover from their drop because they're a good company. The product's solid, the pipeline's solid, the approach to review is solid. There was an error, an anomaly in this process, right? And whether you should release live kernel updates or not that you can't stop or mitigate is a complete different question, but that's a very technical conversation, not for this time or purpose. But what it taught us is that critical infrastructure needs better protection and also, more importantly, better IR and DR. Those are one elements, right? People couldn't recover fast enough and they couldn't recover quick enough and well enough. And that was like, I flew from Vancouver on the Thursday night, landed in Amsterdam on the Friday to change, and the whole world fell apart. And I was amazed at how much of every airline, from booking system to billboards was run on Windows infrastructure using CrowdStrike. So that's point one. Number two is also the openness and vulnerability of cloud providers, right? One that we work with GCP, so I'm going to announce my bias, right? But one thing I like is they actually are quite open in how they secure and deal with APIs. They give you access. They allow you to like learn and develop with them. If I'm honestly pointing the blame for the CrowdStrike incident, yes, and goes to CrowdStrike, but a lot for me goes to Microsoft. Like the way they have protected API security and not properly given people the access, understanding and control around it has probably inherently created these kind of issues without them getting any kind of blame or acknowledgement for what went wrong. So I think that's it. And then the questions I would ask is like, for Marina, what does this mean for like Google Cloud, where you look and say, well, hang on a sec, you could end up being the reason for another application developing something which could make the whole world fall apart. And for Kenneth, like we saw lots of financial institutions and people like yourselves in the software financial chain who fell apart on CrowdStrike. Like, what did you guys, did it affect you? Are you ready for it? Had it affected you? Like, where do you stand? Because I don't work in a traditional IR world like I used to, but I don't know who wants to go first.
I can go first really quick. And I think this definitely, it demonstrated the interconnectedness of the world, right? And this is just one example, but when we were talking about critical infrastructure, there are just so many examples of where things can go wrong. And I think the main point to emphasize here, of course we think about it, right? Because we're a global cloud provider, right? The scale is enormous. And I think that's the same, it's the same case for the other major cloud providers. It's really about thinking through resilience and really ensuring that it's part of all of our processes. It's part of testing, it's part of SDLC, it's part of being able to roll back changes if we need to, and it's part of being able to recover quickly. And so I think all of those aspects are very much top of mind, and the controls are designed in a way to ensure that as best as possible, issues don't occur. But I think that it's not about, to me, it's not about CrowdStrike in particular. It's more about raising awareness of that interconnectedness and thinking about, as an industry, where are the controls that can be put in place to make sure that similar occurrences don't occur. I love Kent's view though.
Yeah, I agree. I have a little bit different perspective also on this. Luckily, we at Plaid, we did not use CrowdStrike, but we very might have got impacted if we used them. So, but this really begs a question. Like typically, when you are in charge of a third-party risk management program, it really begs how carefully you need to evaluate your third-party providers, right? What can go wrong? What is the absolute worst-case scenario with this vendor? Can my business still thrive if this third-party service provider stops providing the service? What is my fallback option? So it is just forcing third-party risk management team to think really deeply on not just the cybersecurity aspects of it, also on the availability. Can a third-party provider just bring down my infrastructure, right? And even for us as a software provider, like Plaid products are being used by 10,000 plus innovative fintechs. So we cannot afford to have a bad code that just crashes every fintech application. So we need to make our products more resilient. We need to think of every possible scenario and how things can go wrong. And it's really, CrowdStrike incident has really forced us to think significantly deeper in what resiliency really means and think through resiliency in a very different manner. Like you have only X amount of time, and so you cannot allocate all of your time equally. So it's all about prioritization. Where do we want to step up our diligence significantly and mitigate our most critical risk? And can we run our business in a manner, like even though all of our services may not be running perfectly, can we run a core critical service in a potentially a little bit degraded manner, but still the core product still exists? It helps users to really use our products effectively. So it really forcing organizations to think through what is our core services, what is our real bread and butter, and what if particular features don't work, what is the ramification? So it is really, CrowdStrike incident has been a very eye-opening incident that has forced a lot of organizations to think about operational resiliency very differently.
Ken, here's a question off the back of that, right? So, as you might know, I was formerly the CISO at Wistic, which is in the TPRM space. And the question I have is, in any level of quality of GRC, would anyone have caught this? Is there any, I've never seen a questionnaire that asked, do you have automated, non-refutable, live kernel level updates? Like, I've never seen that. And I've never seen anyone at an IR or DR level tabletop or run a live test of restoring from kernel level corruption, from like a logic failure at the kernel. Like, I just don't like, the learning from this for me is that there are some things that you've got to have an ability in your team to react to stuff which no one's going to react to. Because this was just an anomaly, which just, you can't see any way that you would have tested or thought of this before it happened.
100%. I 100% agree. I don't think so there's any organization that potentially foresee this exact use case or exact situation and reacted to it, right? But at the same time, it is essentially making people think right now, like, can I run my services in a different environment? Like, if GCP goes down, can I run my service out of Azure, right? Like, people are really thinking through plan B, plan C, and how do I still keep my business resilient, right? Again, you're absolutely right. It is very hard as a third-party risk management professional to foresee everything that can go wrong, but it is really making these teams to think through who are your really, really critical service providers, and can you still survive with them not operating effectively or going out of business. So it is essentially making teams really prioritize their time and efforts in a totally different manner. That's my take on what is this incident actually making people do differently.
Thanks for that. I'm going to shift gears on you a little bit, though. I want to talk about the SolarWinds stuff. We'll start with Marina. Following the Supreme Court's decision to overrule the SEC on SolarWinds, what do you think about the regulatory implications on CISOs because of that?
Yeah, I think it's actually, this has been really fascinating to watch this case unfold. And I think that it sparked the debate over who truly owns cybersecurity in organizations, who's going to be held responsible for breaches, and whether, I think as Jake mentioned a moment ago, whether CISO should have the same legal protections as other executives or should expect to as off the back of these types of these issues. So, taking a step back, in case folks in the audience aren't familiar, the SEC brought suit following the cyber attack on SolarWinds that took place in 2020. And they alleged that SolarWinds and its CISO defrauded investors by overstating their cybersecurity practices and failing to disclose known risks. And the suit really made headlines because it was the first of its kind in a couple of ways. It was a first in terms of the SEC bringing a cybersecurity enforcement claim against an individual, which is the CISO in this case. And it was also the first where the SEC alleged fraud as a cause of action in a cybersecurity disclosure case. And the suit that the SEC filed, I believe, was in 2023. And then last month, what we saw was a New York federal judge dismissing most of the SEC's claims against both SolarWinds as the company and at CISO as the individual, finding that the CISO had not acted with fraudulent intent and didn't deliberately withhold information. But overall, even though many of the allegations were dismissed, the case really still serves as a stark reminder of heightened regulatory oversight, where organizations should expect that their cybersecurity practices are going to be scrutinized. And for our listeners, I think this is a really good time to revisit those existing governance structures and to holistically assess not only the policies and procedures that are in place, but also like how they're being executed, how they're being reported on, and as much as possible, try to ensure that there's the appropriate level of visibility and consistency in terms of the messaging, as well as obviously transparency about the various risks and mitigants that the organization faces. I think the only other takeaway I wanted to mention here, and I'd love to hear from Jake and Ken in terms of their views on this as well, is following the filing of that case, there was this laser sharp focus on potential personal liability. And I speak to a lot of CISOs as sort of my day-to-day, and a number of them who are watching this case unfold really went out to their legal teams immediately afterwards and said, hey, we just want to make sure that, we're included in our organization's D&O insurance policies. Because up until then, they seem to be operating under this assumption that they would be included by default because of that, the C-suite title. And many of them were surprised to find that that wasn't the case. So I'm curious to hear from Jake and Ken if something similar, if they seem to be hearing something similar from the folks that they interact with.
So I think to answer the question directly and then answer some thoughts around SolarWinds directly, I have my own. While the orgs I've worked with and do work with may or may not cover me under theirs, I make sure I have my own as well, because in the end, we've seen different approaches from CEOs in terms of responding to these. I'll come to SolarWinds in a second, but we've also seen multiple orgs, Uber included, kind of leave their CISO out to dry. And so you want to have your own individual protection to make sure that you are covered regardless of what the CEO does. Now, the good, the bad, and the ugly of the SolarWinds stuff, the good is that the CEO, this is the first instance I've seen where a CEO really went to bat. Like, I've met Tim Brown a few times, and he was backed beyond belief. Like, he beat the SEC in the Supreme Court because he had the best and probably the most expensive possible lawyers in the country. And they made sure that they had the relevant education, expertise, and knowledge. The bad is that they didn't overthrow everything. And what that shows you is that if you as a CISO have a security policy or a public security posture, which states certain aspects, it may not be fraudulent, but it may be considered negligent. That you said we do X with passwords, but you don't have, or you can't prove that 100% of your org applies and maintains that standard. And so that is, from a CISO stance, kind of bad and kind of scary. The ugly is that this isn't over. So I've heard multiple sources of the SEC that they are now going to return to come with a different suit, probably more focused around negligence than fraud, and more evidentially based than the first one, which was a bit more circumstantially based, meaning that it's very much becoming now a bit of a posture war, which says like the regulator will come and find different approaches to try and find a way to get somebody effectively, and the business is going to have to find a way, and the individuals are going to have to find a way to defend themselves in the most adequate way possible. I don't think we've seen the end of this. I think what it's shown, though, is the beginning of probably a modern day kind of warfare between CISOs and security leaders and regulators in terms of whether they are or are not liable and responsible for everything that goes on their org, when the modern CISO, to your point, isn't probably an actual ELT member, so isn't actually covered under the standard insurance processes and policies, and more importantly has a role which is so broad compared to like a CRO or a CMO or anybody else in the business that they can effectively be found liable, quote unquote, for stuff that other people did wrong that they didn't know about just because it's technically under security. And so I think there's a lot more questions and answers coming out of this for me than anything else. But Ken, go on, add your 2 cents.
Yeah, not much to add, but this has really made the life of cybersecurity leaders more hard. It was already hard. The additional pressure, the additional threat of suing doesn't make things easier. And the role of a cybersecurity leader is not easy, as you said, right? There are so many net new products, so many dynamics, there's so many decisions on what vendor to use, and there's so many engineering decisions that are taken every second. It is literally impossible for one person to know everything that is happening in the company and all the decisions taken by other leaders, right? Your organization just doesn't run because of the decision taken by a cybersecurity leader. You have your CTOs, you have your senior engineering, you have your senior platform leadership. So everybody's taking decisions every second, and one combination of events or sequence of events can cause havoc. And you cannot predict everything, right? So like, of course, it's a job to reduce the cybersecurity risk, but cybersecurity risk can come in so many different forms and shapes, and it becomes really hard to absolutely guarantee that an organization will never ever have a cybersecurity incident. I don't think so anybody can 100% claim that they will never have or forever have any cybersecurity incident. So this is definitely adding a lot of pressure, and I'm seeing CISOs react to it in wide range of formats. They're negotiating their job differently. They're negotiating the responsibility differently. The general counsel and the CISO team are distributing responsibility differently. So there are a lot of changes because of this change, and not necessarily everything is in the right direction, but it has definitely made the job of a leader much more harder.
what cybersecurity leaders needed, just a little extra rung on that ladder just to kind of really get in there. I am thankful for all that our cyber leaders are doing. So thank you. I feel it's kind of a punishment almost, but anyway, that's my 2 cents. But I want to find out, what do you guys think, Marina, what do you think is this something that's going to happen outside of the financial services sector? Or should we look at this at other industries as well? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's certainly not limited to finance. And I think, as we've been discussing, certainly critical infrastructure sectors like healthcare, manufacturing, communications, energy, all of them are going to be impacted, and to many extents are already. Just in the US alone, I mean, CISO, which is the organization under the Department of Homeland Security that's really charged with focusing on cybersecurity and infrastructure protection, has at this point already identified, I believe it's 16 categories of critical sectors. So I think there are definitely going to be many others besides the financial sector that I've noted, and even the others that I've mentioned already. And this is, it's a common thread through what we've been discussing. It's largely a consequence of the world becoming more digital. The interconnectedness between the organizations and individuals, it's never been greater, which of course it offers immense benefits, but it also introduces these new risks and vulnerabilities that we need to take into account. And I think that the increasing regulatory expectations coupled with the escalating threat landscape have really made GRC a very critical component of organizational risk management. And regulatory pressures have compelled organizations across these various sectors to increasingly focus on compliance and the rising prevalence of cyber attacks that's really brought cybersecurity to the forefront as a top priority. So I think, generally speaking, so many folks you talk to, they see regulations as being very burdensome, but ultimately they are a very important mechanism for setting a baseline of expectations for organizations to follow and ensuring that those organizations are taking appropriate measures to protect the systems and the data that they're charged with safeguarding. So I think in that sense, the growing focus on regulation in this case tends to be kind of like the rising tide that lifts all ships.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Let's shift gears one final time. Let's talk about technology for a minute. Jake, obviously this one's probably going to be geared for you. Is there a way to automate some of this? I mean, there's got to be some kind of tool or something that helps people know that New York just passed this law and it kind of goes with this and it goes with this other piece of. Please tell me you guys have a solution to this, because frankly, it does sound like a headache for people. Talk to me.
So Anecdotes is built to help alleviate this headache in as much as we can automate the control or collection of evidence that's applicable to relevant regulation, and also take an evidence-driven approach that means that not only is there a control saying, yes, you met this, but here's the relevant evidence attached that shows that you met it, which means that you can work with Fortune or large-scale enterprises who can then engage with top-tier auditors, which is rare in the compliance automation space. And I think the main key point at the front is that as we introduce new frameworks and new regulations to the platform, you can see where you stand. So you can effectively take what we call a gap assessment and say, okay, so there's now NIS2 coming into place. Let's put it in. It will automatically cross-map against existing evidence, and therefore through API connections to your application stack, gather and collate any new relevant evidence to show you where you stand right now against NIS2. Are you 60% compliant versus 81 versus 94% compliant? What do you need to do to actually become 100% compliant with regulation should you need to be? And what are the relevant risks that you can kind of curate and document associated with that regulation? Again, you can maintain inside the analyst platform's risk management. I will always say there are competitors to us relevant. We're not the only people who do this, but I do think we're one of the best that do it. But yeah, certainly, if you're going to try and tackle complex, ever-changing regulations in large-scale complex businesses where you have multiple applicable frameworks and certifications, then being able to automate the collection of evidence, being able to cross-map against various standards, frameworks, and certifications, and be able to demonstrate that in an evidence-led approach, a core and fundamental to freeing your GRC team, as Marina said, to focus on the stuff which is hard. And this is becoming ever more an important part of cybersecurity. So free people up from the tasks which are mundane and you really don't take that much brain power or knowledge, make it easy and allow them to deal with things which are more challenging.
Yeah.
Kenneth, what do you think about this? You're the compliance guy. I mean, you have to use something like this. Is this? I mean, what are your thoughts around it?
So these technologies are super critical, and just transparently, we use Anecdotes at Plaid as well. These technologies are super critical because for me, when I build my team, I primarily want my team to quantify or identify technology risk which we can manage, and I want my team to advise the business on how to reduce this risk by identifying potential strategies or validating our hypothesis, right? And sometimes doing this manual mapping, doing this gap assessments can be super time intensive. So if I have a tool that essentially tells me that I'm 60% through because I've already invested in other compliance regimes and other regulations, and it can give me a head start that, okay, like we believe that you are meeting 60% of the requirements because of these reasons, because it can automatically map these artifacts. That 60% time save is like a huge win for agile teams like the shop that I run at Plaid, right? I don't have infinite number of people working on GRC, and I want them to focus on certain areas more. And having this technology empowers your smart people to do more smart work, and 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 we're seeing audit firms are leveraging this technology more and more. And what I really like about this is it's not a point in time exercise. Yes, we had this password policy 2 days back, right? It's essentially telling over a period of time what we say is what we did, and if you didn't do it, it helps you quickly identify the deviation and run your remediation steps. So I do believe these technologies are very important for any organizations that has process sensitive data. They are critical to other organizations. They need to be able to measure their compliance program quickly and effectively, and these technologies definitely help these teams to be more impactful at their role.
So it sounds like there's some definite great opportunities here for GRC teams. Marina, what do you think? How do you see this moving? GRC teams from being the cost center. I hate that term, but you know what I mean. You're a cost center versus a profit center kind of thing. How do you see this moving those teams from actually kind of being like more of a business enabler driver? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm very supportive of control streamlining, of policy as code, of making use of AI capabilities generally, quote unquote, like traditional AI capabilities, but certainly the Gen AI capabilities that have been developed in recent years and amplifying a lot of the efficiencies that can be gained from it. And I agree with you. I'm very sort of negative on seeing GRC positioned as a cost center, particularly because I've actually spent so much of my career in that role, but also because I think that it can absolutely be positioned as much more of an enabler, because there's so much that can be done to demonstrate and articulate how those GRC initiatives have led to tangible benefits for the business, and where the operational efficiency improvements have been taken, and where there's been a reduced risk exposure that ultimately protects the organization in the long run, both from financial and legal and reputational risk. So to me, it's kind of my approach is usually kind of a trifecta. So I try to focus on the business outcomes. I also look to build relationships with stakeholders and really try to break down any entrenched views and kind of a siloed mentality that often exists. And then, of course, taking that step towards modernizing processes, both technologically and operationally. And so to me, like doing these three things really helps overcome that perception of GRC as a cost center, and goes a long way toward paving that path to being seen more as strategic advisors, as partners, because they can then demonstrate their value and closely align the efforts that they're undertaking with the organization's overall business objectives, so that you see that they go in lockstep. But I think those types of efforts are obviously not a one-time exercise, right? It's an ongoing effort. It really requires evangelizing that message that, throughout all levels of the organization, and really being able to back it up with tangible updates and metrics that you can use to quantify the benefits of the GRC initiatives. So I think it's helpful where you can use metrics. Other things that I've seen folks do well is like using illustrative success stories to really articulate and make memorable sort of the impact of some of the work. Because I think it's really critical to communicate that, consistently and often throughout the organization to really drive that message home. And of course, it requires a concerted effort. So it's highlighting the operational processes, the technological streamlining, and ultimately the impact on staff, exactly as Ken said, to open them up to do work that isn't manual and repetitive, but is really challenging for them and helps to bolster their careers while also supporting the organization.
I like it. I like it. A good positive message right toward the end there. I like it. Thank you so much. That concludes our time with our panel today. Unfortunately, I could have kept asking them questions. I got a whole 12 more, frankly, but we're up with our hour. So, Marina, you're on my screen still. So why don't you assign some homework? I feel like you kind of just did a little bit with your thought there you just had, but what's something that people can start doing, maybe next week, that will affect some, positive outcomes, right, for their organization?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think, my call to action for listeners is to really try to embrace the future of GRC through technological innovation and see how it can make us even better at what we already do. And really to continue to do that through the technical aspect, but also through building the relationships across teams and departments, and really the industry more broadly. Because I very firmly believe that if you're taking these steps, it benefits not just GRC professionals in positioning themselves as strategic partners to the business who contribute to the organization's success, and of course on a personal level, furthering their careers, but ultimately on a macro level, really drive a much more secure and resilient future that everyone benefits from.
I like it. I like it. Ken, what do you got? Some homework?
Yeah, on a similar note, I really do believe that organizations do need to adapt with the new technology advancements, and especially with generative AI helping you to really summarize huge text of information, question on existing huge wall of text, regulations, huge. There is definitely options. There is definitely scope for organizations to really go deep and understand these compliance obligations, and generative AI is a great tool that can help in these regards. And also with risk assessments, being able to identify certain similar risks being exploited for other organizations, and doing this research at scale and in a smart manner can really empower GRC teams to do a much better job at their role. So definitely I would advise anybody to explore this fascinating field of generative AI and how it can help or unpack your GRC teams to be more impactful. Just echoing on what Marina said.
Good stuff. Thank you, sir. And by the way, Kenneth actually has a great session on GRC using generative AI stuff from our AI virtual conference that we did about a month or so ago. You can go check that out. You should. It's actually a really solid presentation. So anyway, I digress. But Jake, you want to give us some homework?
The first thing, I'm impressed that we got to 1 hour and 5 minutes without anyone mentioning AI, which I think might be a new record in podcasting webinars in 2024.
That was pretty good.
No, too quickly. I think first is key into what's not happened yet. People dial into regulations when they've already come out. Dial into what's coming down the pipe. It's not hard. Like, you can find the stuff just through Google of what's being discussed in the EU, what's being discussed at the US federal level or at state level, what's been discussed in the various financial regulators or energy regulators. Like, find out what's coming next so you can start to prepare and think for it in the future. But I wouldn't be doing my job as a vendor if I didn't say, come and learn what we do, right? This is what Anecdotes does. We automate and take away this headache and allow people like Plaid and Kenneth to make their lives easier and allow their people to focus on more meaningful, interesting work by automating the collection and providing an evidence-driven approach to GRC compliance automation. So if you want to learn more, then you can reach out to me directly or on LinkedIn or to anyone else. But yeah, hopefully that's of interest as well.
Yeah, they've got Anecdotes has some good stuff in the resource tab, so download that stuff now. check it out. I mean, it's free stuff. It's a great way to, apparently it's better than Excedrin. So that's what I'm hearing, because you're going to get rid of headaches, right? So I'm obviously being a little silly, but check it out. Good stuff. If you could automate this process, why wouldn't you? I mean, that's just what my thought is, but I always go for the easy route because I was in sales. So that's me. So anyway, thank you guys for joining us. Thank you, Marina. Thank you, Kenneth. Thank you, Jake, for letting me pick your brain on all of these different regulations that have popped up. Homework, I would say, keep checking out SecureWorld stuff. I try to have as much educational content as possible. I've been doing a series called Ask a Lawyer once a quarter. This is not sponsored. I've got 3 cyber attorneys that come on and they ask all the dumb questions I can come up with. So please join us for those. I can help you with that stuff. You can actually ask questions ahead of time when you register. So if you might actually get your question asked. So check out that stuff. And while I'm at it, we have more thank you, Anecdotes, I should say, for making this possible. But we do have more remote sessions on the way. We always do. We've got more stuff. There's 3 of them this week. Somebody doesn't like me, or they like me a lot. Maybe that's the case. I'll go with that. They like me a lot, or you guys like hearing me. Maybe that's it. But tomorrow we've got securing data in the era of Gen AI. There's your AI, Jake. And then we're going to be talking to Proofpoint about being better safe than spoofed. Curious about what that one is. And then, we got Know Before coming up in September, cracking the code on ransomware. Apparently, ransomware is not going to exist after September 10th. So make sure you sign up for that one. After that, we've got more stuff. HSMs, critical infrastructure stuff, unveiling CTEM, and then, like I talked about, Ask a Lawyer, October. That concludes our remote session today. If you have not done so already, download your certificate of attendance down there in the widget bar down there at the bottom. Otherwise, in about an hour, you'll get an email from SecureWorld Digital that says, hey, thanks for attending. This is your CPE. So that being said, grab those resources. Thank you again to our wonderful panel of experts. We're going to see these people around again, I'm sure. These are awesome people. They know a lot of stuff. I'm going to try to have them back. So we'll hopefully see and hear from them again. But this concludes the growing role of GRC controls in financial regulations. Have a great rest of your day and be safe. Thanks.